At my family reunion, I was asked to enter through the service door. The young woman at the check-in table glanced at her clipboard, forced a smile, and pointed toward the side of the building. Staff and vendors enter through that door, ma'am. I stared at her for a moment. I'm sorry? I asked. She looked uncomfortable. The poor thing couldn't have been older than 22. That's what I was instructed to tell you, Mrs. Calloway. I looked toward the grand entrance of the Hillcrest Country Club, where dozens of members of my family were walking, through polished glass doors beneath a banner that read, Welcome Calloway Family Reunion, 2026. Children were laughing. Cousins were hugging. Someone had already started taking family photos on the lawn. And somehow, I was being directed to the same entrance used by caterers and maintenance workers. I smiled. Then I picked up my handbag and quietly walked toward the service entrance. What happened next changed the way I saw my family forever. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story has traveled. The July heat settled heavily over the Texas countryside as I made my way around the side of the building. At 68 years old, I had attended more Calloway family reunions than anyone else present. In fact, for nearly 30 years, I had been the one organizing them. I was the woman who mailed invitations, the woman who coordinated catering, the woman who remembered birthdays, anniversaries, and family milestones. After my husband Walter passed away 5 years earlier, I stepped back from planning the events. But I still believed family mattered. Perhaps that was my first mistake. The service entrance opened into a narrow hallway behind the ballroom. Employees pushed carts, loaded with plates and silverware. A chef hurried past carrying trays of appetizers. Nobody stopped me. Nobody questioned why I was there. To them, I probably looked exactly like someone who belonged in the back. I smoothed the wrinkles from my blue dress and continued walking. Walter had always loved that dress. The memory made my chest tighten. For 42 years, he had been the person who made every room feel welcoming. Without him, gatherings often felt different, colder, less familiar. But I told myself today would be different. Today was supposed to be about family. At least that's what I believed when I spent nearly 2 hours getting ready that morning. My silver hair had been carefully styled. My pearl earrings were the same pair Walter gave me on our 25th wedding anniversary. Even my handbag had sentimental value. I carried it to every major family celebration. As I entered the ballroom from the rear corridor, I immediately noticed something strange. The room fell into an awkward silence. Not completely, just enough. The kind of silence that happens when people are talking about someone and suddenly realize that person has entered the room. Conversations paused. Eyes shifted. Several relatives quickly looked away. I felt the change immediately. A knot formed in my stomach. Still, I smiled. I had spent decades smoothing over uncomfortable moments. I could survive one more. Nana? A small voice broke through the tension. My great-nephew Mason ran across the room and wrapped his arms around my waist. I hugged him tightly. For a moment, everything felt normal again. Then his mother hurried over. "Come on, Mason," she said quickly. "We need to go." Her smile toward me looked forced, almost guilty. Before I could respond, she guided him away. The knot in my stomach tightened. I scanned the room. Large round tables filled the ballroom. Each one carried elegant signs displaying branches of the family tree. There was a table for the Arizona Calloways, a table for the Oklahoma relatives, a table for Walter's cousins from Louisiana. Near the front stood a beautifully decorated head table. My son Nathan sat there. Beside him sat his wife, Sabrina. Sabrina looked stunning, as always. Perfect blonde hair, designer dress, flawless makeup, the image of a devoted daughter-in-law. Anyone seeing her from across the room would think she was the heart of the family. I used to think that too. Nathan spotted me. For a brief second, our eyes met. I expected him to smile, maybe wave, maybe stand and greet me. Instead, he looked away. as if he hadn't seen me at all. The hurt landed harder than I expected, not because he ignored me, but because he did it so naturally, as though it had become a habit. A hostess approached, carrying a seating chart. "Mrs. Calloway?" "Yes." She glanced down nervously. "Your table is this way." I followed her through the ballroom, past relatives, past cousins, past family members I had known their entire lives. She kept walking and walking until we reached a small table tucked into the farthest corner of the room, near the kitchen doors, near the staff station, near the service entrance, where I had been told to enter. Only one place card sat on the table. My name, Margaret Calloway. E stared at it, then slowly looked toward the front of the room where the rest of my family sat together. Laughter echoed across the ballroom. Music played softly overhead. Everyone appeared exactly where they belonged. Everyone except me. And in that moment, sitting alone in the corner of a reunion I had spent half my life helping build, I realized something chilling. Being sent through the service door wasn't a mistake. It was a message. And someone had gone to great lengths to make sure I received it. The place card sat in front of me like a quiet insult. Margaret Calloway. Nothing else. No mention of family. No branch designation. No seat among my children, grandchildren, or cousins. Just my name on a small folded card at a table hidden near the kitchen doors. For a few moments, I simply sat there. The ballroom buzzed with conversation around me. Glasses clinked. Laughter drifted from table to table. Somewhere near the stage, a group of younger relatives were taking photos in front of a large family banner decorated with old Calloway photographs. I recognized many of the pictures. Most of them had come from my albums. Some had been hanging in my hallway for decades before I donated them for the reunion display. Funny how easily people can use pieces of your life while pretending you no longer belong in it. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and watched. After Walter died, I learned that silence often reveals more than questions ever could. People become careless when they think you aren't paying attention. And that afternoon, I noticed everything. Nathan barely looked in my direction. Each time someone approached the head table, he greeted them warmly. Handshakes, smiles, small jokes, the same easy charm he had inherited from his father. But whenever his eyes drifted toward the corner where I sat, something changed. A stiffness settled over him, almost like guilt. Sabrina, meanwhile, seemed completely at ease. She moved through the ballroom like she owned it, greeting relatives, directing staff, adjusting decorations, checking schedules. Several times I watched people approach her with questions that should have been directed to family elders. Instead, everyone seemed to treat her as the person in charge. I couldn't remember exactly when that shift had happened. Maybe it wasn't one moment. Maybe it had happened slowly, year after year, conversation after conversation, family gathering after family gathering. Like a shoreline disappearing one grain of sand at a time, a waiter appeared beside my table carrying iced tea. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" His kindness caught me off guard. "Thank you," I said. He placed the glass carefully in front of me. As he walked away, I noticed something strange. Every other table had pitchers of tea and water already waiting. Mine didn't. A small detail. But by then, I was beginning to understand that small details mattered. I took a sip and looked around the room again. The Calloway family had grown enormously over the years. When Walter and I attended our first reunion as a young married couple, fewer than 30 people had come. This year, there were nearly 100. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, new spouses, new babies, entire generations that existed because people like Walter and I had spent decades keeping everyone connected. I remembered the reunions we hosted at the ranch. Walter grilling steaks beneath the oak trees. Children running through the fields. Relatives staying late into the evening telling stories under strings of lights. Back then, family felt simple, not perfect, but genuine. A burst of laughter pulled me back to the present. At the front of the room, Nathan was sharing a story with several cousins. Everyone laughed, even Sabrina. For a moment, I found myself smiling too. Nathan had always been good at making people laugh. When he was 10 years old, he once performed an entire pretend news broadcast from our kitchen table. Walter laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. The memory warmed me, then cooled just as quickly. Because the man laughing at the head table wasn't looking at me. He wasn't wondering why his mother was sitting alone. He wasn't asking why she'd entered through the service corridor. He wasn't asking anything at all. And somehow, that hurt more than outright cruelty. Cruelty requires effort. Indifference does not. A few minutes later, someone slid quietly into the empty chair beside me. I turned and found Avery, my granddaughter, 23 years old, fresh out of college, smart enough to see things most people missed. "Nana," she said softly. I smiled immediately. Avery had always been different. Even as a child, she noticed when people felt left out. She noticed when someone was hurting. Most importantly, she noticed when something wasn't fair. "You look beautiful today," she said. "Thank you, sweetheart." Her smile appeared briefly before fading. I could tell something was bothering her. She glanced toward the head table, then toward the room around us, as though making sure nobody was listening. My stomach tightened. The expression on her face reminded me of someone carrying a secret that had become too heavy to hold. "Avery?" She lowered her voice. "Nana, I need to tell you something." I set my glass down slowly. The noise of the ballroom seemed to fade into the background. "What is it?" She hesitated. For several seconds, she simply stared at her hands. Then she finally spoke, and the first sentence out of her mouth explained exactly why I had been sent through the service door. "Nana, this wasn't an accident." The words settled heavily between us. Across the room, Sabrina was laughing with relatives near the stage, completely relaxed, completely confident, as if everything was going exactly according to plan. And for the first time that day, I began to suspect that being seated alone in the corner wasn't the worst thing they had planned for me. Avery's words stayed with me long after she spoke them. "Nana, this wasn't an accident." For a moment, I simply looked at her. The noise of the reunion continued around us. Silverware clinked against plates. Children chased each other near the dance floor. Someone adjusted the microphone near the stage where speeches would be given later that afternoon. Everything looked normal, but suddenly, nothing felt normal anymore. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. Avery glanced toward the head table again. Nathan was speaking with several cousins. Sabrina stood nearby, smiling as she directed a pair of event staff carrying flower arrangements. Even from across the room, she looked completely in control. Avery lowered her voice. The seating chart wasn't created by the country club. I felt my stomach tighten. "Who created it?" She hesitated. Then she answered. "Sabrina." The answer didn't surprise me as much as it should have. What surprised me was how little emotion I felt. No anger, no shock, just a strange sense of confirmation, like finally seeing the missing piece of a puzzle that had been sitting unfinished for years. Avery continued. "I was there last week when they were finalizing everything." "What exactly happened?" She looked uncomfortable. I wasn't supposed to hear the conversation. Those words usually mean someone heard something they wish they hadn't. I waited patiently. A lifetime of motherhood had taught me that people reveal more when they don't feel rushed. Avery took a breath. "Sabrina specifically asked that your seat be moved." The ballroom suddenly felt colder. I folded my hands together. "Did she say why?" Avery nodded slowly. "She said the reunion needed to focus on the future of the family." The phrase sounded harmless at first. The future of the family. A sentence that could easily appear on a greeting card. But there was something beneath it. Something sharp. "What does that mean?" I asked. Avery gave a small, humorless laugh. "Apparently it means people like you shouldn't be the center of attention anymore." The words hurt, not because they were unexpected, but because they were spoken aloud. There is a difference between suspecting something and hearing it confirmed. For years, I had sensed myself slowly being pushed toward the edges of family events. The signs had been small, easy to dismiss. A forgotten invitation, a late phone call, a decision made without consulting me. Each individual moment seemed harmless. Together, they told a different story. Avery leaned closer. There was more. Of course there was. There always is. What else? Sabrina told Dad that people listen to you too much. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because it sounded exactly like something Sabrina would say. Over the years, I had watched her carefully. Not with suspicion, not at first, just with the curiosity any mother has when someone new enters her family. Sabrina was intelligent, organized, ambitious, the kind of woman who could walk into a room full of strangers and have everyone liking her within 10 minutes. People admired that quality. Nathan certainly did. But there was another side to her, a side that only appeared when she thought nobody was paying attention. She liked control, not influence. Control. There is a difference. Influence inspires people to follow. Control requires people to move out of the way. And lately, I had begun to realize that I was standing in the way of something. Avery looked down at the table. "I shouldn't even be telling you this." "Then why are you?" She met my eyes. "Because it's wrong." The answer came immediately, without hesitation, without calculation. Just honesty. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Across the room, applause suddenly erupted. Someone had announced the beginning of the family recognition ceremony, a tradition dating back decades. Originally, Walter had started it. Every year, family members were recognized for achievements, milestones, and contributions. College graduations, military service, business successes, community involvement. It had always been one of my favorite parts of the reunion. I looked toward the stage. Several relatives were already gathering. The master of ceremonies adjusted his microphone. Then something caught my attention. A large display board stood beside the stage. It was covered with photographs documenting the history of the Calloway family. Pictures from nearly 50 years of reunions. Walter appeared in many of them. So did Nathan. So did countless cousins and grandchildren. I stood slowly. "I'll be right back." Avery looked confused. "Where are you going?" "Just to look at something." I walked toward the display. As I approached, a strange feeling settled over me. At first, I couldn't identify what was wrong. Then I saw it. My heart sank. Walter's photographs were there. Nathan's photographs were there. Even Sabrina appeared in several recent reunion pictures. But mine were almost entirely missing. I stepped closer, scanning carefully. One photo, then another, then nothing. Decades of organizing reunions. Decades of hosting gatherings. Decades of keeping family traditions alive. Reduced to a single small photograph tucked into the bottom corner. Easy to overlook. Easy to ignore. Easy to erase. I stared at the display for several long seconds. Behind me, people continued talking and laughing. Nobody seemed to notice. Or perhaps they had noticed and chosen silence. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. "Mrs. Calloway?" I turned. One of my older cousins stood nearby. His expression looked uncomfortable, almost embarrassed, as though he had seen my reaction. Before I could respond, he quietly said something that made my stomach drop. "I thought you knew." "Knew what?" He glanced around nervously, then lowered his voice. "The family meeting, later today." A chill moved through me. "What family meeting?" His eyes widened. For a moment, He looked genuinely surprised. You mean nobody told you? The knot in my stomach tightened again, because suddenly I understood something important. The service door, the isolated table, the missing photographs. None of those were the real purpose of today. They were only preparation. Something much bigger was waiting. And whatever it was, everyone seemed to know about it except me. I thought you knew. My cousin's words echoed in my mind long after he walked away. The family meeting. Nobody told me about it. Not Nathan, not Sabrina, not a single relative. I stood in front of the photo display for several seconds, staring at pictures that documented half a century of Calloway history. The realization settled heavily on my shoulders. Whatever was planned for later that afternoon, I wasn't supposed to know about it. And somehow, that hurt more than the service door, more than the isolated table, more than seeing my photographs quietly removed from the family story. Because exclusion sends a very specific message. It tells you that people aren't simply ignoring you. They're making decisions about your life without you. I slowly returned to my table. The ballroom seemed different now. The smiles looked rehearsed. The conversations felt guarded. Everywhere I looked, people appeared to know something I didn't. Avery was waiting for me. The concern on her face deepened as soon as she saw my expression. What happened? I sat down carefully. There's apparently a family meeting later today. Her eyes widened. For a moment, she looked exactly like my son used to look when he was caught doing something he shouldn't have. You found out? The answer told me everything. I didn't even need to ask another question. You knew too. Avery lowered her eyes. Only a little. I nodded slowly. At least she was honest. That was becoming a rare quality in the room. What is this meeting about? She hesitated. I could see the internal struggle playing across her face. Part of her wanted to protect her parents. Another part wanted to protect me. Finally, she spoke. It has something to do with the ranch. My chest tightened. The ranch. Of course, it was the ranch. Everything important in the Calloway family eventually led back to the ranch. Nearly 40 years earlier, Walter and I had purchased the property when it was little more than neglected pasture land. Most people thought we were crazy. The fences were falling apart. The barn roof leaked. The house needed extensive repairs. But Walter saw potential where others saw problems. Over time, we transformed it into something beautiful. Family cookouts, summer reunions, birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings. Entire generations of memories had been created there. For years, the ranch wasn't simply land. It was the heart of the family. And now, someone wanted something from it. I could feel it. Avery leaned closer. I don't know all the details, but you know enough to be worried. She nodded. Yes. I looked toward the head table again. Nathan was laughing with several relatives. Sabrina stood beside him, confident, relaxed, perfectly composed. You would never guess she was hiding anything. That was one of her greatest strengths. She understood appearances. She understood presentation. She understood how to make people believe a carefully constructed version of reality. The more I thought about it, the more old memories began resurfacing. Small moments I had dismissed over the years. Conversations that suddenly made sense. Comments that seemed harmless at the time. One memory stood out. About 2 years after Walter passed away, I had mentioned updating part of the ranch property. Nothing major. Just restoring one of the older guest cabins. Before Nathan could respond, Sabrina had immediately interrupted. Honestly, Maggie, maybe it's time to think about simplifying things. Simplifying. I had heard that word many times since becoming a widow. Simplify your house. Simplify your finances. Simplify your responsibilities. Strangely, nobody ever suggested simplifying when Walter was alive. Only after he was gone. Only after people started seeing me as someone easier to move aside. At the time, I ignored the comment. Now I wondered how many similar remarks I'd overlooked. A voice from the stage interrupted my thoughts. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could have your attention. The room gradually quieted. People returned to their seats. The annual recognition ceremony was beginning. I watched relatives receive applause for promotions, graduations, volunteer work, and community achievements. The audience smiled. Photos were taken. Stories were shared. Everything looked warm and heartfelt. Then something unexpected happened. The host reached the end of his list, and my name was never mentioned. Not once. For several seconds, I thought perhaps there had been a mistake. After all, every year the family recognized elders who had contributed to preserving family traditions. For decades, Walter and I had been included. This year, there was nothing. No acknowledgement. No appreciation. No mention at all. The ceremony ended. Applause filled the room. People stood and began mingling again. I remained seated. Not because I expected recognition. At my age, applause matters very little. What mattered was the pattern. The service entrance. The isolated table. The missing photographs. Now this. Each event by itself could be explained away. Together, they formed something else. Something deliberate. Someone was carefully rewriting my place in the family, and they were doing it in front of everyone. A few minutes later, I noticed movement near the ballroom entrance. An older gentleman had just arrived. Gray suit, leather briefcase, measured steps. The moment I saw him, I recognized him. Raymond Pierce, Walter's longtime attorney. My pulse quickened slightly. Raymond wasn't family. He never attended reunions. In fact, I couldn't remember seeing him at a social gathering in years. Yet here he was, walking directly into the middle of the Calloway reunion. For a brief moment, I saw something flash across Sabrina's face. Not fear, not yet, but surprise, as if his presence was completely unexpected. Raymond scanned the room. His eyes eventually found mine. Then he nodded. A small, deliberate nod. The kind that carries meaning. The kind that says, "We need to talk." And suddenly, I had a feeling that whatever was about to happen during the family meeting was far bigger than a simple discussion about the ranch. Raymond Pierce waited until the crowd became distracted before approaching my table. The annual recognition ceremony had ended, and the ballroom had returned to its steady rhythm of conversations and laughter. Most people were focused on the buffet stations or catching up with relatives they only saw once a year. Nobody seemed to notice the 73-year-old attorney making his way toward the woman sitting alone in the corner. I noticed, and judging by the brief glance Sabrina sent in our direction, so did she. Margaret. Raymond's voice carried the same calm authority I remembered from years ago. It's been too long. I stood and hugged him. For a moment, I felt unexpectedly emotional. Raymond had been part of our lives for decades. He had helped Walter navigate business deals, property agreements, and family trusts. More importantly, he had been one of Walter's closest friends. After Walter died, I saw less and less of him. Life has a way of shrinking social circles as the years pass. But seeing him now felt like seeing a piece of my old life walk back into the room. "You're looking well," he said. I laughed softly. That's a generous statement. It's an honest one. His eyes moved briefly across the ballroom. Then his expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to know this wasn't a social visit. "Would you mind taking a walk with me?" I already knew the answer before he finished asking. Something important was happening. Of course. We stepped away from the crowd and moved toward a quieter hallway near the conference rooms attached to the country club. The noise of the reunion faded behind us. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Raymond seemed unusually careful, as though he was deciding where to begin. Finally, he stopped beside a large window overlooking the golf course. "Margaret, has anyone discussed today's family meeting with you?" I almost smiled. There it was. The question I'd been waiting for. No. His jaw tightened slightly. I suspected as much. The response confirmed what I had already begun to fear. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't poor communication. This was intentional. I folded my arms. What exactly is this meeting about? Raymond studied me for a moment. Perhaps he was trying to decide how much I already knew. How much has Avery told you? Only that it involves the ranch. He nodded slowly. Then I'll start there. The ranch. Again, everything led back to the ranch. A familiar heaviness settled into my chest. Raymond continued. For the past several months, certain family members have been discussing a proposal. Proposal? To sell the Calloway Ranch. The words landed quietly, but their impact was enormous. I stared out the window. The green fairways blurred slightly. Sell the ranch. The place where Walter taught Nathan to ride horses. The place where every grandchild celebrated birthdays. The place where family reunions had been held long before country clubs became fashionable. The place that carried the fingerprints of 4 generations. Sell it. As if it were nothing more than real estate. I felt a familiar ache behind my ribs. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to grief. Who wants this? I asked. Raymond's silence answered before his words did. Sabrina has been leading the effort. Of course she had. I wasn't even surprised anymore. The pieces were fitting together too neatly. The service entrance, the corner table, the missing photographs, the deliberate exclusion. If Sabrina intended to convince the family to sell the ranch, removing me from the conversation made perfect sense. I represented history, memory, tradition, the one thing standing between the ranch and a buyer's contract. When did this begin? I asked. About a year ago. A year. A full year of conversations happening behind closed doors. A full year of decisions being discussed without me. A full year of people smiling to my face while planning something they knew I would oppose. Raymond looked uncomfortable. There is something else you should know. The words immediately caught my attention. People only say that when the first piece of bad news isn't the worst piece. I waited. Several relatives have already been told that ownership decisions are largely symbolic now. I frowned. What does that mean? It means some people believe you no longer have meaningful authority regarding the property. For a moment, I simply stared at him. The statement was so absurd it almost felt funny. Almost. Walter and I had spent decades protecting that land. Every legal document, every tax payment, every expansion, every improvement. Yet somehow people had been convinced that I no longer mattered. The realization explained a lot. It explained the confidence I'd seen in Sabrina all afternoon. She wasn't behaving like someone hoping to win. She was behaving like someone who already believed she had. Raymond opened his briefcase. My eyes followed the movement. He removed a thick folder and held it in both hands. Immediately, my pulse quickened. There was something deliberate about the way he handled it. Something important. Margaret, he said quietly. Before Walter passed away, he asked me to safeguard several documents. For the first time all day, I felt genuinely surprised. Walter had always been meticulous, the kind of man who planned 3 steps ahead, but he rarely kept secrets from me. What kind of documents? Raymond looked directly into my eyes, the kind that may completely change what happens at today's meeting. The hallway suddenly felt very still. Back in the ballroom, distant laughter drifted through the walls. The reunion continued, as if everything were normal, as if families were celebrating, as if history wasn't about to collide with the future. Raymond placed one hand on the folder. Then he said the words that made my heart skip a beat. Margaret, before anyone votes on the future of that ranch, there are some truths your family needs to hear. Raymond's words followed me all the way back to the ballroom. Before anyone votes on the future of that ranch, there are some truths your family needs to hear. He didn't show me the documents. Not yet. He simply closed the folder, returned it to his briefcase, and told me to trust him. Trust. It was a word that felt heavier than it once had. Over the past few hours, I had learned that trust could disappear quietly. Not in dramatic betrayals. Not in shouting matches, but through small choices, conversations held behind closed doors, decisions made without your knowledge, seats assigned at the back of a room, photos quietly removed from a display. I returned to my table feeling older than I had that morning. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of tiredness that comes from realizing the world you've trusted may not be exactly what you believed. Across the ballroom, preparations were underway for the family meeting. Staff members adjusted chairs near the stage. Additional tables were being moved aside. Several relatives gathered in small groups, speaking in lowered voices. The atmosphere had changed. The reunion no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like everyone was waiting for something. Or perhaps everyone already knew what was coming, except me. As I sat down, Avery immediately noticed the expression on my face. What did Raymond say? I looked at her for a moment. Walter always said Avery had the same eyes I did. Eyes that revealed thoughts before words. Enough to know today isn't really about a reunion. She nodded slowly. I was afraid of that. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me. Nana, can I ask you something? Of course. Would you ever sell the ranch? The question hung between us. Simple. Direct. Important. I looked across the room, past the crowded tables, past the decorations, past the people. In my mind, I saw the ranch. The old oak tree Walter refused to cut down. The front porch where we drank coffee every morning. The barn we rebuilt after a storm nearly destroyed it 20 years ago. The pasture where Nathan learned to ride. The pond where grandchildren spent summer afternoons fishing. The ranch wasn't simply property. It was memory made visible. I don't know, I finally answered. Avery looked surprised. I thought you'd say no. So did I. And that was the truth. 5 years ago, my answer would have been immediate. Absolutely not. End of discussion. But age changes perspective. You begin to understand that buildings aren't people. Land isn't family. Sometimes holding on to something too tightly can become its own kind of burden. The real question wasn't whether the ranch should ever be sold. The real question was why people felt the need to hide the conversation from me. Avery seemed to understand, because she nodded quietly. That's what bothers me too. A burst of applause interrupted us. Nathan had stepped onto the stage. The room gradually settled. Conversations ended. People returned to their seats. The meeting was beginning. I felt my stomach tighten, not from fear, from certainty. Whatever happened next had been planned long before anyone arrived at the country club. Nathan adjusted the microphone. He looked nervous. I noticed it immediately. Most people probably wouldn't have, but mothers recognize things others miss. I remembered the same expression before his 5th grade spelling bee, before his first baseball championship, before he proposed to Sabrina. Nathan always touched his wedding ring when he was anxious. He was touching it now. "Thank you all for coming," he began. Polite applause followed. He smiled, looked around the room, then continued. As many of you know, our family has grown significantly over the years. Heads nodded throughout the ballroom. With growth comes change. There it was. Change. Another word that sounds harmless until someone uses it to justify something painful. Nathan continued speaking about family legacy, future generations, financial responsibilities, property maintenance, the increasing costs associated with preserving the ranch. Every sentence sounded reasonable, carefully prepared, carefully practiced, and somehow completely disconnected from the deeper issue. Because this wasn't really about maintenance. It wasn't about taxes. It wasn't about practical concerns. This was about control. I could feel it. Then Sabrina stepped onto the stage beside him. The shift in the room was immediate. Nathan looked relieved, as though he was handing over responsibility, as though he preferred someone else deliver the difficult parts. Sabrina smiled warmly, the same smile that had impressed so many people over the years. "First, I want to thank everyone for being here." More smiles, more nods, more approval. She knew exactly how to work a room. I believe every family reaches moments when difficult decisions become necessary. There was that word again. Necessary. Another pleasant word used to soften unpleasant intentions. She clicked a remote control. A presentation appeared on a large screen behind her. Charts, numbers, property valuations, development projections, potential sale figures. A murmur spread through the audience. I watched faces change. Some surprised, some interested, some excited. Money has a way of capturing attention, especially when large numbers are involved. Sabrina allowed the information to settle before speaking again. The ranch has served our family well for decades. Served, not belongs, not matters. Served. Even her choice of words felt calculated. But we must think about the future. I glanced toward Raymond. He stood near the back of the room, quiet, patient, watching. His briefcase remained closed, for now. Then Sabrina delivered the sentence she'd likely been building toward for months. The family leadership team has been discussing a proposal to sell the ranch and establish a financial trust that benefits future generations. The room erupted into conversation. Questions, come-ons, excited whispers. Nathan remained silent. Sabrina remained composed, and I remained seated, because suddenly I understood why they had placed me at the back, why they wanted me entering through the service door, why they removed my photographs, why they excluded me from every conversation. They needed me to appear irrelevant. Because if people remembered who built the ranch, if people remembered who still carried Walter's trust, then their entire plan might fall apart. And judging by the calm expression on Raymond Pierce's face, I had a feeling that was exactly what was about to happen. The room exploded with conversation the moment Sabrina finished speaking. People leaned toward one another. Questions bounced from table to table. Several younger relatives looked excited. A few older family members appeared uncertain. Others seemed completely caught off guard. The large screen behind Sabrina continued displaying numbers, projected sale values, estimated trust distributions, future investment growth. It all looked impressive, professional, convincing. That was the danger. When numbers appear on a screen, people often stop asking who created them. They stop asking whose interests are being protected. They stop asking who benefits most. I remained seated. The corner table suddenly felt less humiliating than it had earlier. From where I sat, I could see everyone. Every reaction, every nervous glance, every carefully hidden expression. Nathan stood beside Sabrina, looking uncomfortable. He smiled when people smiled. He nodded when people nodded. But something about him felt different, less confident than she was, as if he had agreed to a plan without fully understanding where it would lead. Sabrina, meanwhile, looked completely at ease. She held the remote control in one hand and answered questions with polished confidence. The trust would ensure fairness. The property taxes continue to rise. The land requires substantial maintenance. The family has outgrown the ranch. Each statement sounded reasonable. Each statement received approving nods, and yet none of them addressed the real issue. Nobody had asked the people who built it. Nobody had asked the people who protected it. Nobody had asked me. I watched quietly as the discussion continued. Then an older cousin stood. His name was Douglas, 70 years old, practical, respected, the kind of man who rarely spoke unless he had something important to say. "How many family members support this proposal?" he asked. Sabrina smiled. A significant number. Not an answer. Just a polished way of avoiding one. Douglas seemed to notice. "Can you be more specific?" For the first time all afternoon, I saw a tiny crack in Sabrina's confidence. Not much. Just enough. Many of the family leaders have already expressed support. Again, not an answer. A murmur moved through the room. People were beginning to notice the difference. A few exchanged uncertain glances. Questions create problems for people who rely on carefully controlled narratives. Then someone asked another question. "What does Margaret think about all this?" The room became noticeably quieter. Not silent, but close. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. Some curious, Some sympathetic, some uncomfortable. Nathan looked down. Sabrina's smile tightened, and suddenly I understood something important. They hadn't expected anyone to ask. The entire afternoon had been built around making me invisible. Invisible people don't get asked for opinions. Invisible people don't influence decisions. Invisible people sit quietly in corners while other people decide their future. I slowly stood. The ballroom remained still. For a brief moment, I thought about Walter. He always believed dignity was more powerful than volume. He never raised his voice when he could speak calmly instead. I tried to do the same. I appreciate the question. My voice carried farther than I expected. Years of hosting family events had taught me how to speak clearly. No microphone required. I looked around the room, at cousins, children, grandchildren, faces I had known for decades, faces I had held as babies, faces connected to memories stretching across half a century. The truth is, nobody asked me. The sentence landed heavily. Several people exchanged surprised looks. A few frowned. One cousin actually sat up straighter. I continued. Today is the first time I've heard a proposal to sell the ranch. More murmurs. More confusion. People were beginning to connect pieces of the puzzle. Sabrina stepped forward quickly. I'm sure that's just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. The same kind of misunderstanding that put me at a table near the kitchen. The same misunderstanding that removed my photographs. The same misunderstanding that forgot to mention a family meeting. I smiled politely. I don't believe it is. The room grew even quieter. For the first time all day, Sabrina seemed uncertain. Only slightly, but enough. Nathan finally looked at me. Really looked at me. Not past me. Not around me. At me. The way he used to when he was younger. The way he used to before life became complicated. Before loyalty became confused with obedience. I could see conflict in his eyes. That hurt more than anger would have, because it meant some part of him knew this wasn't right. A younger cousin stood near the front. If Margaret wasn't included, why wasn't she included? Another uncomfortable question. Another crack in the foundation. Sabrina opened her mouth, then closed it. The answer wasn't simple. The real answer would reveal too much. And everyone in the room knew it. The silence stretched, long enough to become noticeable, long enough to become dangerous. Then, from the back of the ballroom, a familiar voice spoke. I believe I can answer that. Every head turned. Raymond Pierce stepped forward. Gray suit, leather briefcase, calm expression, steady eyes. He walked slowly toward the center aisle, not rushing, not dramatic, just deliberate. The room parted naturally as he moved. People recognized him. Some knew him as Walter's attorney. Others knew him as one of Walter's oldest friends. But everyone understood one thing. Raymond Pierce never involved himself in family matters without a reason. My pulse quickened, not from fear, from anticipation, because I remembered the folder inside his briefcase. The folder he had refused to show me. The folder Walter had apparently prepared years ago. Raymond stopped near the stage. Then he looked directly at Sabrina. For the first time that day, her confidence disappeared completely. Only for a second, but I saw it. And judging by the sudden tension in the room, I wasn't the only one. Raymond rested one hand on his briefcase and spoke calmly. Before this family makes any decisions about the future of the Calloway Ranch, there are several documents Walter Calloway instructed me to present. The room fell silent, completely silent. And for the first time since arriving at the reunion, I realized the meeting was no longer under Sabrina's control. The ballroom became so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning overhead. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every eye followed Raymond Pierce as he walked toward the stage. Even Sabrina remained frozen beside the presentation screen. For the first time all afternoon, she looked genuinely unsettled. Not angry. Not embarrassed. Worried. And there is a big difference between those emotions. People become angry when things don't go their way. They become worried when they realize they may not be in control. Raymond placed his briefcase on a nearby table. Then he opened it. The sound of the metal clasps seemed unusually loud in the silence. I found myself holding my breath, not because I knew what was inside, because I didn't. Walter and I shared almost everything during our marriage. Yet Raymond's words earlier suggested my husband had prepared something without ever discussing it with me. At the time, that thought felt strange. Now it felt important. Raymond removed a thick folder, several legal documents, a sealed envelope, and what appeared to be an older, leather-bound binder. The moment I saw the binder, I recognized it. Walter kept it in his office for years. He called it his legacy book. Inside were photographs, financial records, land surveys, family history notes, and handwritten observations he'd collected throughout his life. I hadn't seen it since shortly before his death. A murmur spread through the room. People recognized it too. Raymond adjusted his glasses, then spoke. Many years ago, Walter asked me to assist with long-term planning for the future of the Calloway Ranch. His voice remained calm, professional, steady. The voice of a man who understood the weight of every word. He anticipated that one day discussions regarding the property might become complicated. Several relatives exchanged glances. Nathan looked confused. Sabrina looked increasingly uncomfortable. Raymond continued. Because of that possibility, Walter created a series of legal protections designed to preserve both the property and the family's ability to make informed decisions. The phrase caught my attention. Informed decisions. Not manipulated decisions. Not rushed decisions. Informed decisions. A subtle but important distinction. One cousin raised his hand. What kind of protections? Raymond opened the folder. He removed the first document. This property was transferred into a protected family trust 11 years ago. Several people frowned. Others appeared surprised. Apparently, many relatives had never heard this before. I hadn't either. The room grew noticeably more attentive. Raymond continued. The trust contains several provisions regarding ownership, management, and future disposition of the property. Disposition. Attorney language for what eventually happens to an asset. I watched Sabrina carefully. She no longer looked confident. She looked like someone desperately trying to predict what would be said next. Raymond turned a page. Then he spoke the sentence that changed everything. Most importantly, no sale can occur without the approval of the trust's primary trustee. Silence. The kind of silence that feels physical. A few relatives immediately looked toward Nathan. Others looked toward Sabrina, assuming one of them held that authority. Raymond slowly shook his head. Then he looked directly at me. The primary trustee is Margaret Calloway. The room erupted, not loudly, but suddenly. Questions, whispers, confused conversations, people turning toward one another, trying to process what they had just heard. Across the ballroom, Avery's eyes widened. Nathan looked stunned, and Sabrina. Sabrina looked completely blindsided, as if someone had removed the floor beneath her feet. I remained seated. Not because I was trying to make a statement, because I was genuinely surprised. Walter had never told me. Not once. I thought back to countless conversations over the years. Every discussion about the ranch, every financial decision, every estate planning meeting. And suddenly I realized something. Walter wasn't preparing for his death. He was preparing for human nature. He knew people change. He knew grief changes families. He knew money changes relationships. Perhaps he simply wanted to ensure that nobody could erase the people who built what everyone else inherited. Raymond raised a hand for silence. Gradually, the room settled. There is more. Of course there was. There is always more. He opened the sealed envelope. The paper inside appeared slightly yellowed with age. A handwritten letter. Walter's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. The sight alone tightened my throat. For a brief moment, the ballroom disappeared. I wasn't sitting at a family reunion. I was standing in our kitchen 30 years earlier, watching Walter write notes at the counter while drinking coffee. The memory hit me harder than I expected. Raymond unfolded the letter, then began reading. To my family, the room became completely still. If this letter is being read, it means a decision concerning the future of our ranch is being considered. Every word felt unmistakably Walter. Direct, simple, honest. I hope those discussions are guided by respect rather than convenience. Several people lowered their eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably. Nobody interrupted. Raymond continued reading. The ranch is not valuable because of its acreage, not because of its buildings, not because of its market price. It is valuable because of the sacrifices made by the people who created it. My eyes filled unexpectedly, not with sadness, with recognition, because Walter understood something many people forget. Property isn't built by documents. It's built by years, by effort, by commitment, by showing up again and again when nobody is watching. Then came the sentence that changed the atmosphere of the entire room. If anyone deserves to determine the future of this property, it is Margaret. A collective silence swept across the ballroom. I looked toward Nathan. His eyes were fixed on the floor. I looked toward Avery. Tears glistened in her eyes. Then I looked toward Sabrina. For the first time all day, she had no response, no prepared speech, no polished explanation, no presentation slide, because some truths cannot be argued away. And as Raymond carefully folded Walter's letter, I realized the most important revelation wasn't that I held the authority to stop the sale. It was that Walter had trusted me with that authority all along. The family had spent the entire day trying to make me invisible. Yet the one person who knew the full story had ensured that I could never be erased. For several seconds after Raymond finished reading Walter's letter, nobody spoke. The ballroom that had been filled with confident opinions only moments earlier now sat in complete silence. Not because people didn't know what to say, because they finally understood what had happened. The entire afternoon had been built around one assumption, that I no longer mattered. And now that assumption had collapsed in front of everyone. I looked around the room, at cousins who suddenly seemed unable to meet my eyes, at relatives who had quietly accepted the story they had been given, at family members who had watched me enter through a service door and never once questioned why. I wasn't angry. Strangely, that feeling had disappeared somewhere along the way. What remained was sadness. Not for myself, for all of us. Because families rarely break apart in a single moment. They drift apart one small compromise at a time, one ignored truth at a time, one silence at a time. Nathan slowly stood. Every eye followed him. For the first time that day, he didn't look toward Sabrina. He looked at me. His expression reminded me of the little boy who used to sit at our kitchen table after making a mistake. The boy who knew he was wrong but didn't know how to fix it. Mom. His voice cracked slightly. The room remained silent. I didn't know. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. Nathan swallowed hard. I knew we were discussing the ranch. He paused. I knew Sabrina had been organizing things. Another pause. But I didn't know about the seating. His eyes dropped briefly. I didn't know about the photos. The guilt on his face was impossible to miss. I didn't know you'd been excluded from the meeting. For a moment, he struggled to continue. Then he looked directly at me. And I should have. The honesty in those words hit harder than any apology. Because they were true. Nathan wasn't a cruel man. He wasn't malicious. He was simply someone who stopped paying attention at the exact moment attention mattered most. That happens more often than people realize. A few seats away, Avery quietly wiped tears from her eyes. I smiled at her. Without her courage, none of this would have happened. Without her honesty, I might never have known the truth. Then Nathan did something unexpected. He stepped away from the stage, walked across the ballroom, and stopped beside my table, the same table near the kitchen, the same table where I had been placed like an afterthought. Slowly, he pulled out the empty chair beside me and sat down, just like he used to do when he was young. The gesture was simple, but sometimes simple things matter most. I'm sorry, Mom. No excuse. No explanations. No speeches. Just the truth. I reached over and squeezed his hand, because despite everything, he was still my son. And because forgiveness is not something you give to someone who deserves it, it's something you give when you decide the pain no longer deserves control over your heart. Across the room, Sabrina remained standing near the stage, alone. The confidence she carried all afternoon had vanished. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, she quietly approached. The entire room watched. When she finally stopped in front of me, she looked different somehow. Smaller. Not physically, emotionally. I owe you an apology. The words seemed difficult for her. Maybe because they were, I thought I was helping the family. I listened. Nothing more. I convinced myself that efficiency was more important than tradition. She glanced toward the photographs, toward the tables, toward the room itself. But I crossed a line. For once, there was no performance in her voice. No strategy. No presentation. Just regret. I nodded politely. Not because everything was fixed. Some wounds require time, but acknowledging the truth is where healing begins. Raymond eventually stepped forward once more. The proposal will not move forward today. Several relatives nodded in agreement. No one argued. No one objected. The decision was unanimous. Not because of the trust documents. Not because of legal authority. Because people finally understood what the ranch represented. It wasn't simply land. It was history. And history deserves respect. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Families slowly returned to conversations. Children resumed playing. The tension that had filled the room all afternoon gradually disappeared. Yet something felt different, lighter, more honest. As the evening came to a close, people began saying goodbye. Several relatives approached me. Some apologized. Some shared memories of Walter. Others simply hugged me. None of them could change what had happened, but they could choose what happened next. And that mattered. Eventually, I gathered my handbag and prepared to leave. The sun was beginning to set outside. Golden light spilled across the country club grounds. I walked slowly through the ballroom one final time, past the stage, past the family displays, past the tables filled with generations of Calloways. Near the entrance, I paused. The service corridor was visible down the hallway, the same corridor I had used when I arrived. The same corridor they expected me to use. I looked at it for a moment, then smiled, and turned the other direction, toward the front entrance, toward the large glass doors facing the setting sun. As I stepped outside, I felt the warm Texas air against my face. Behind me, laughter drifted from the reunion. Ahead of me, the parking lot stretched beneath a sky painted with shades of gold and orange. I thought about Walter, about his letter, about the trust he had placed in me. Not just legally, personally. He had known something I was only now beginning to understand. A person's place in a family is not determined by where they are seated, not by who introduces them, not by whose name appears on a program. It is earned through years of love, sacrifice, and presence. No seating chart can erase that. No photograph can remove it. No service door can diminish it. When I arrived that afternoon, I entered through the door reserved for staff, a door chosen for me by people who wanted me out of sight. But when I left, I walked through the front entrance with my head held high. Not because I had won, not because anyone had lost, but because I finally remembered something important. I had never been a guest in the Calloway family. I was one of the people who built it, and that was something nobody could ever take away. Looking back, I learned that respect isn't something your family gives you with words. It's something they reveal through their actions. When people try to push you into the background, don't rush to fight for attention. Time has a way of exposing the truth. Walter taught me that real legacy isn't land, money, or property. It's the values you leave behind and the lives you've touched along the way. And sometimes, the strongest thing a person can do is quietly stand in their truth until everyone else finally sees it too. Above all, I learned that no one can make you insignificant unless you forget your own worth first.